Well, I'm sure you've heard by now,
Canada could be sitting on the biggest housing bubble of all time.
but is there actually a housing bubble? And if there is it going to just gently deflate or is it going to pop? And who's most at risk? Is it going to affect some people more than others? Some places more than others? And are those losses going to be real or mostly artificial? Well, we're going to talk about all of that. We're going to discuss 4 different categories of people that I think should be most concerned about this data. Let's get nerdy with it. Now, before we could talk about the effects of a housing bubble breaking, we first have to talk about some of the context and how we got here in the first place, because it's always been based on supply versus demand. I mean, the whole crux of our problem, and this is literally decades in the making, is that demand has been outpacing supply. In fact, demand has been outpacing supply so much so that as of present day, we are the worst performing country in all of the G7. We literally have first world problems. Let's look at Ontario as an example. 30 years ago, 8% of a new home's construction was related in some form to a government, either in duties, fees, or taxes. As of right now, it's about 31%. In fact, if you're a developer in Ontario right now and you're looking to build a home, it's going to cost you somewhere in the neighborhood of $137,000 just in taxes in order to build that home. Throw onto that a ton of red tape. The subdivision process used to take somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 years in order to process. Fast forward to today's date, and that same process takes about 10 years. Put that all together, and obviously that has an impact on housing supply. Ontario today builds about the same amount of housing units as it did 20, 30 years ago. And I don't think I need to tell you, but the population has changed since then. It's particularly true with the lax immigration policies that we've had. There is nowhere in Canada that hasn't been affected by this. Alberta saw a significant increase in immigration. Saskatchewan saw a significant increase in immigration. Manitoba saw it. Atlantic experienced it. British Columbia felt it. But the province that undoubtedly experienced it the worst? Ontario. Most of that big population boom that Canada is experiencing is directly related to immigration, with the most recent boom being associated to international students. Right now, it's estimated that Canada has so many international students that 1 in every 50 people that you meet in Canada presently is likely to be an international student. And all of these people are looking for a place to rent. That's going to be an important stat that we're going to come back to a little later in this video because it's very relevant to these inflated housing values. But it's not the only important stat. In fact, right now it's also estimated that there's about 1 million people that aren't accounted for in the national data. A majority of these people being non-permanent residents who overstayed their visas. And most of those people are looking for a place to rent as well. In addition to all of that, because of rising rates and the increase in the stress test, less people are able to qualify for the mortgages that they qualified for before. In fact, some people don't qualify at all, leading to even more people renting. So that should come as no surprise then that purpose-built rentals and condos purchased by investors in certain markets are on the rise in the last 5 years. In fact, if you look at Atlantic Canada, purpose-built rentals are now being built at a rate 5 times larger than your standard single-family home. Manitoba is seeing a similar trend. Saskatchewan is seeing a similar trend. The balance in Alberta has recently tipped to favor purpose-built rentals. In fact, the only 2 markets that haven't seen purpose-built rentals exceed production of non-purpose-built rentals are BC and Ontario, and that's because they have robust condo markets, many of which are being scooped up by investors to serve the same purpose. Now put all of that information to the back of your mind for a second and let's talk about some of the headwinds that the Canadian housing industry is going to experience in the next few years. It's going to feel like a death by 1,000 cuts, and it could be enough to topple Canadian housing prices. Let me just check the time real quick. Yeah, it looks like it's time to subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you're alerted when new videos come out. You could also do me a favor and give that like button a little kiss. That would be great. Let's look at some of the factors that could potentially influence the Canadian housing market that aren't so close to home. Look at the Chinese housing market, for instance, that's in full-blown panic. You've got Evergrande and Country Garden, 2 of the largest developers in all of China that have now defaulted on their loans. As a result, the Chinese government has banned their own government elites from owning foreign property in order to prop up the yuan, and that could lead to less spending in Canada and, in fact, sell-offs of some of that Canadian property. Now, some people are saying that this is going to have a significant impact on the whole Canadian housing market, and it likely won't. But remember, it doesn't have to be. This is a death by 1,000 cuts. Canada's household debt has now risen to $2,340 billion, meaning we now have more household debt than our entire nation's annual GDP. We are consuming more than we are producing, and that's particularly concerning when the cost of carrying so much debt is so much more expensive in this interest rate environment. This significant pressure on the average Canadian household has started to become a significant focus for a lot of economists and banks, especially since delinquencies on unsecuritized debt seem to be on the rise. Then throw into the mix the fact that your average Canadian mortgage is only locked in for 3 to 5 years, not like its American counterparts where they're locked in for 25 to 30 years. Which means that come 2024, you're going to start having the first round of fixed rate mortgages start to convert into the new interest rate environment. And with that comes a certain payment shock. Now, banks and financial institutions are doing whatever they can to try to mitigate that, including extending the amortization to as long as possible to try to reduce those payments. But that will only be able to stay some of that effect. Most Canadians are still going to feel some kind of payment increase. Banks and economists are concerned that with rising mortgage payment and rising interest payments on unsecuritized debts, that there's going to be less discretionary income for Canadians to spend on goods and services. And less discretionary income on goods and services means less profit for businesses. Less profit for businesses means rise in unemployment. A rise in unemployment could lead to less discretionary income with a repeating cycle. And this would not be a good thing for most people. This may also mean that a lot of the immigrants that came to Canada to make it home might also decide that all of these added financial pressures just aren't worth it. And a lot of them may decide to leave, and they may go just as quick as they decided to come. Now, with all of that being said, who's at most risk if this housing market were to suddenly deflate? And I really think there's 4 categories of people that definitely should be keeping an eye on things over the next few years. The first is condo owners in Toronto and Vancouver. You might remember that back in 1990 when interest rates hit 13%, that the Toronto housing market came tumbling down. Sales plummeted and the value of homes eventually declined until it hit its bottom somewhere in 1996, losing more than a quarter of its value from its then peak from just a few years earlier. I think it's possible that we might see something similar play out in the next few years, and that the condo owners are the ones that are particularly vulnerable to this change. A lot of the people who own these condos bought these condos because that's the only thing that they could or were able to afford. Given the chance, most of them likely would have chosen a single family house. So if the housing market starts to see some consistent, meaningful decline, you're going to see a lot of people opt to go the single family housing route and skip condos altogether. Especially since, as I mentioned in one of my other videos, a lot of these condos are seeing significant increases to their strata and condo fees, making them even less appealing. Number 2, anytime Canada sees some kind of deleveraging or recessionary cycle, there is 5 industries that see the highest unemployment: real estate and construction, manufacturing, retail, leisure, and hospitality. I think it's possible that even if the housing bubble doesn't pop entirely, or we just enter into this living dead environment where housing prices stay flat for a really, really long time to come, that these 5 industries are set to see some significant challenges and struggles regardless of that fact in the next few years. Now, I'm not saying to go ahead and go and change your career just yet. All I'm saying is if you're in those industries, make sure that you put some savings aside. Number 3 are the investors that are way too over leveraged and are only able to cash flow their properties if these high rents continue. And when you hear this, this is when you'll find the Canadians in the comment section on the news and other financial videos cheering on this housing bubble to pop. But there's really only 2 groups of people that are cheering on this housing bubble to pop: the rich and the ignorant. The rich don't mind that the housing prices come tumbling down. I mean, from their perspective, for the most part, it's an opportunity to buy even more real estate assets. A lot of them aren't leveraged to the hilt, meaning they're not required to sell, meaning most of their losses are artificial in nature, because until they sell, they're not actually realizing that loss. Until then, they can just offset the loss on their tax returns and wait until the asset regains its value. And the ignorant, well, they cheer on the housing bubble pop because they think it means that they're going to be in a situation where they're now going to be able to buy a house. And for some of them, that's maybe true. But for most of them, that's simply not true. In an environment where many people are losing their houses or selling their houses, or the value of these houses are dropping in value, why would the bank be willing to take a risk on you in that economic environment when they weren't even willing to take a risk on you in this economic environment where things were trending upward? Just doesn't make any sense. Number 4 is probably the most obvious, and it's people already fully leveraged or close to fully leveraged on all of their credit. If you're already in a situation where you're tapped out on your credit facilities, these next few years are going to be very difficult for you, even more difficult than the years you've already gone through. And it likely means that you need to consult professional financial help now.
So I have to move the probe ground to the rectifier output ground, which is, I think, this shit